All right, everybody, hello and welcome to another episode of In the Mixer as we continue our season preview ahead of the Hyundai A-League season, which kicks off this weekend. Given that we are now releasing these episodes in no particular order, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the Adelaide United correspondent, Thomas, who is the busiest man in football. Tom, how are you, man?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you, Sean?
I'm very, very well. I won't lie, I recorded a podcast before this one as well, so I'm already 2 whiskeys in, which usually means the content is going to be just phenomenal wall-to-wall nonsense. And hopefully
Brilliant.
you can very quickly steer the ship or get on my level. It could go either way at this point.
Yeah, let's see how quickly I can catch up.
Definitely. So Adelaide United, obviously a foundation club within the league, some tremendous memories. Obviously the two premierships spring to mind, but I'll go through their full list of trophies shortly. What initially attracted you to Adelaide and made you fall in love with the boys from South Australia?
I guess it was purely for the fact I come from the northern suburbs of South Australia, and so we didn't have a side that we were sort of like connected to from the grassroots. So prior to Adelaide United entering the NSL, the big clubs in South Australia are Adelaide City, West Adelaide, clubs like that, with long memories in the NSL, lots of history, big supporter base. But being where I was situated growing up, that sort of thing we weren't connected to, and we couldn't get there every week. So as soon as Adelaide United were formed with the inception and the idea of being the people's team, like a team for all South Australians, I think my dad saw the beauty in that and took me along to the first game that we played at High Marsh in that first season in the NSL. And just from there, it bit me, the bug bit me.
Yeah, I think a lot of different people struggled with the old NSL days. I was relatively young when the A-League first began in high school and still tried to get amongst it. But I think one of the big obstacles a lot of people felt was that if they didn't have a certain, familiar history or national background, they weren't welcome in certain environments for those old NSL teams. Obviously, that was super intense in a lot of suburbs within Melbourne, where I grew up, and very similar stories with the likes of, Adelaide City, West Adelaide, even Metro Stars to an extent for those
Yeah.
NSL sides playing within Adelaide. How important do you think it was in that particular area or that region of the world to have, a unified and centralised Adelaide side representing them in a national in a national setting?
I think it was excellent. I mean, I was very young when the side was incepted, so I think I was 12 years old maybe. And so I missed all of the political furore that went on with the NSL, and I sort of missed whatever the media was misconstruing as ethnic rivalries or whatever jingoistic crap that was on the news at the time. But for me and where Adelaide United has evolved, Adelaide United is now situated out of the northern suburbs, so our training base is at Playford. A lot of the boys now live north of the city to get to training into the games at High Stadium every week or every second week. So for us especially, it was massive. I mean, everyone I knew jumped straight on board. There was because we have clubs out there like Manapara, Modbury, Para Hills, which are all good clubs, and people recognise those from South Australia, but nothing like this. Like you said, a unified effort to combine the talents of South Australian football, and I think it's reaped incredible rewards.
Yeah, and for international listeners, of which there are probably none, but we can always dream and hope.
Wellington,
South Australia has such a proud tradition of getting behind their local teams, and I think they really thrive in that us against the world or us against the other states mentality, particularly when you talk about rivalries between Victoria and South Australia, and anywhere in South Australia in reality. So the support for that club really since day one of the A-League, selling out what is a great little stadium in Cooper's Stadium, has been fantastic, and a massive credit to the organisation, the fans in the area, and obviously a big part of the league itself. So looking through their background, obviously we briefly mentioned it earlier, the premiership in 2005, 2006, and then again in 2015, 2016 in the most unlikely of circumstances, which we'll touch on a little bit in a moment. Of course, that championship as well, the grand final win in 2016. The scenes at Adelaide Oval, I think, are reminiscent of some of their greatest sporting achievements in both AFL, cricket, whatever other sports. So it was definitely a comparative atmosphere on that day. And the inaugural FFA Cup champions in 2014, a competition that they still perform very well in to this day, and potentially will add another one to their trophy cabinet in the final in a couple of weeks. Of those various trophies that you've managed to win, which of those resonate the most with you, and which of those give you sort of the fondest memories as a club?
As soon as you mentioned the championship, a huge grin came across my face, because I was fortunate enough to go to the game, and it was really the pictures and the memories from it. It's just an iconic day at the refurbished Adelaide Oval, and I'm biased, of course I'm biased. Perhaps only the India-Pakistan World Cup cricket game that was played at that Oval could rival it, but the atmosphere, the noise, just the colour, the explosion of people, and just this raw passion. I've never seen so many people unite behind the game as that day. And it's a shame that it only happens on these tokenistic one-off events, but that lives. That's the one, the championship, definitely.
Yeah, you don't ever have to apologise for being biased. I think it comes with the territory. And, given that a lot of us have met either in meme forums or just through friends we know playing football together or against each other, yeah, you certainly don't ever have to apologise for bias for your hometown club, because it lets me get away with a little bit more when I'm biased towards my team. So it's a good standard to set, I think, for everybody. But yeah, definitely fantastic memories of that season, and I think for a lot of impartial clubs or clubs who weren't performing well that year and weren't going to win it themselves, to see Adelaide rewarded for what was a pretty remarkable turnaround from worst to first in the league was a great story and a great narrative, and obviously Western Sydney doing them a favour by throwing away another grand final appearance made it a little bit sweeter as well. But that really was an exceptional team that they put together at that time. One of the things that I think we've consistently seen come up throughout these season previews is that when you have a really good squad and everyone's performing at a really high level, the expectations of individuals in terms of extra money, which is tough in a salary cap league, and obviously the increased pressure that comes from other clubs, both within the league and within the larger Asian region, means that it can be tough to keep those sort of squads and groups together. So yeah, a shame that we weren't able to see that squad really kick on and become a powerhouse in the league, similar to what we've seen with Brisbane and Sydney over the most recent years. But I think it's definitely up there in one of the strongest teams for the last 14 years of A-League football that we've had.
Yeah, for sure. We talk about that incredible Brisbane team that went 36 unbeaten, and then the recent Sydney team that we've seen. Never really hear about that Adelaide side that really got it going for 20 games or 25 games. I think we ended up having that incredible run across. It's probably for that reason that it wasn't as long-lived that we think about it in the memories, but I would put that team against that Brisbane side, and it would be a hell of a game.
It would be an entertaining fixture, given that they went about their football the right way. It's a really unique conversation, and I think I'm probably burying future podcast episodes when we talk about like Hall of Fames and greatest teams and all that sort of thing. But certainly, I think if you compare Sydney, who's been the most recent, I think, dominant side, that Brisbane side and Adelaide as well, they all achieved very unique things in very different styles. And that Adelaide side, while they didn't break the same records, they didn't necessarily have the same, mystique around them, given that they weren't together for that long a period. Some of the momentum they had and the way that they just kept carrying themselves through games and just destroying everyone put in their way, particularly during that final run, was probably as good a patch of form and as good a series of performances as we've ever seen in the league. Comparative almost to, for certain points, when you were down towards the bottom of the division, a cup run almost, where every game was a situation where you had to win or your season was essentially over.
Yeah, no, definitely that. I was just thinking, City were on the receiving end of that twice that season, so I know now why it lives long in your memory.
I still have imagery of just sitting there watching Stephen Mork warm up for Adelaide as he's taking his game to an almost elite A-League level, while I'm watching Osama Malik having a goalkeeping coach do his shoelaces up for him at the other end. It definitely goes down in history as one of the worst trades in the history of domestic sport, let alone A-League football. But we'll talk about that one a little bit further down. If we look at the club owners, now club ownership groups are a bit of a mixed bag in the A-League. Usually if they're running very, very well, you don't hear from them that much. Something of a unique one with the previous ownership group. I will just touch on them briefly. Robert Gerrard, Dr. Richard Noble, Bruno Marveggio, and the very outspoken Greg Griffin. They carried that team through as local businesses for a long period and through that championship reign. How important do you think their run was in establishing Adelaide United in terms of becoming an entity within that league, within Adelaide, and also in terms of providing financial stability for the club now and into the future?
You mentioned Greg Griffin's name around the stadium, and that will elicit mixed responses. I think there was some functional issues with the way the club was run and the way it interacted with its fan base. There seemed to be a notion amongst the fans that with the group ownership, they were running it essentially as a business, and there wasn't sufficient investment within the team. And I think that championship run that we had, where everything just came together, at a complete fortune, really, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that it's tough to gauge without the benefit of hindsight, but where you see teams suffer a little bit for on-field performance, in the end, they get something that eventually elevates them to a new structure. The big thing that, obviously, City fan, when I talk about the Melbourne Heart takeover, is that their initial investments were around training facilities and training pitches and making sure that there were world-class or, best-in-class football arenas and facilities available. And we've seen similar things for both Melbourne Victory and Sydney FC now. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those squads are consistently now appearing in the top, 4 in the division. Whereas for Adelaide, that period where they did struggle, they did quite a bit behind the scenes to secure long-term stadium deals, long-term training facilities to improve those facilities quite a bit. So while that is short-term pain for those particular seasons, and we'll go through their last 5 league positions shortly, the long-term benefits, I think we kind of start seeing the benefit of now, particularly, and we'll talk about this further as well, the continued performance in the FFA Cup. There's something going on in Adelaide where their conditioning and their readiness for round 1 is well and truly ahead of most other teams in the division. Before we move on, though, I do want to touch on the mysterious Dutch consortium chaired by Piet van der Poel. Kind of came out of nowhere, this one. It wasn't really broadcast that Adelaide was for sale at all before the announcement that they had been purchased. What do you know, being based in Adelaide, about this mysterious Dutch consortium, and what is the fan view of the way they're running the club, where they want to remain relatively anonymous and just having the one chairperson speaking on their behalf?
Yeah, I mean, it took us by surprise. It took me by surprise, certainly. I'm not sure how many people within the club structure knew. It was quite a quick announcement from Griffin and co that they were willing to sell.
And we briefly mentioned it, but Greg Griffin is quite outspoken. I feel like it must have been a relatively abrupt negotiation because I just feel like he would have come out and said something if it wasn't really quickly and efficiently managed.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. I think he had fielded offers in prior years. There was talk about Red Bull coming in at one point, and there was some other offers, but he always just appeared to price the club out of the reach of the people that were looking for it. So I suppose this consortium that have come in, they had the necessary funds and they had the infrastructure to bring with them that satisfied Greg Griffin and his consortium as well. To be honest with you, I don't know a lot at all about the ownership at the moment. What we can say is that this pre-season, through membership drives, fan engagement, player transparency, these guys seem to understand exactly what the fans were looking for under the previous administration. And like you did touch on before, a lot of people probably don't give Greg Griffin and co the praise that they deserve for the infrastructure investments they made, because that training facility out of Playford is excellent. A lot of money went into that, a lot of thought and time, a lot of understanding of the region and the area of which football blooms in South Australia. Like you said, that is a long term. You're seeing it in the squad now, as I'm sure we'll get to, but there are a lot of guys that have come from the youth academy now that are first on the team sheet, essentially.
Yeah, definitely, and we'll explore that squad a little bit further, but really the final piece of the puzzle from an Adelaide perspective, the one thing that they don't have and the thing that they've sanded out as something that they're interested in, is ownership of Cooper Stadium. And if they can get that, like that's becomes, when you start having conversations around like a 50-year, 100-year plan and dynasty where you own all the assets that the club needs. You're not paying anything off. You're not paying off leases. Like, you're consistently building revenue each year. So off the field, doing a lot of very interesting things. If we were going to put on our speculative hat, and you got to pick who this mysterious Dutch consortium might be, because I have a sneaking suspicion that we're not hearing anything about it because they're closely affiliated with an existing team that is perhaps based in Holland. Who ideally would you like to see them have a club affiliation with over in the Eredivisie?
Oh, yeah, it has to be Ajax, right? I mean, that's the number one. And I think you sort of try and make connections. Like, if you're going to focus on a youth system and try and implement that same sort of groundwork, I mean, I think it's Ajax for sure, right?
Yeah, I haven't even put on my tinfoil hat yet. So this is purely speculation on my part. But yeah, I do think that there must be more to it than perhaps the information that we're getting. And if it does come out down the track, it'll be really interesting to see what the interaction is. I was kind of sitting there waiting with bated breath for a slew of Dutch signings to come through. It hasn't necessarily worked out that way. There is one player that's come back from Holland, but we'll highlight him further down in the run sheet. But yeah, an exciting time. It's good to see that we are getting that sort of international exposure as well, where we now have ownership groups, obviously the City Football Group being a big one, Holland, Indonesia, China. There's a lot of different investment coming into this market from a lot of different regions within the world. So we'll look at the last 5 league positions. In 13-14 finished 6th, 14-15 finished 3rd, 15-16, as we previously mentioned, finished as premiers on top of the league itself. 16-17 then dropped all the way back down to 9th, and then last season 5th in the league and an elimination final loss. What was your season highlight from last year? Obviously, I think the big one that sticks out there is the yo-yo nature of it, and we'll discuss that a little bit further down. From last season, focusing on 17-18, what was your greatest highlight for the season?
I think within the 27 games in the A-League, it's always if you can get a victory over Melbourne Victory. And to beat them at Etihad Stadium, which is that now Marvel Stadium?
It is indeed.
Yeah, so formerly known as Etihad Stadium. When we beat them there that day 2-1, that night 2-1, we had 2 red cards. Izzo saved a Borussia penalty. Blackwood and Barber scored, which is just probably the most miraculous thing of the day. That was definitely a season highlight.
Yeah, I think it's a decent one. It's always very satisfying to go to someone's home ground and beat them, particularly given that Adelaide and Melbourne Victory were fierce rivals in that first few seasons of the A-League, particularly the infamous 2006 final. 2006-2007 final.
It did not take you long to bring that up.
No, I wasn't going to, but I had just you have to humble everybody if we're all starting from a place of humility. That no one gets carried away. You should have heard my Sydney FC podcast. All I did was try and keep him grounded the entire time. But yeah, so what do you think is some of the cause behind the yo-yoing in the division? We do see it quite a bit, and I kind of tried to touch on a little bit where it's tough to keep talented squads together if you are operating on a smaller budget. But certainly to drop from premiers to 9th the year after and getting back into finals football, do you see that trend continuing, or are the club making the right moves to kind of arrest some of that slide and continue developing?
I would love to be ambitious and say that I can't see it continuing, but I think in the build-up to this season, there's been a lot of interesting press releases, media chats between coaches and FFA representatives. And I think it was Gregor Rohr that mentioned in an interview with Simon Hill that he saw the league as a definitive Big Four, being the 2 Melbourne sides and Western Sydney and Sydney, and that everyone else under that, I suppose, takes a second seat at the table. Mike Occurs himself has come out and said in the build-up to this season that a salary cap league that we are in, it's okay to be a rich club with a salary cap, but when you're not so flushed with cash, it makes it a little bit more difficult, and you do actually see disparities open up within the salary cap anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You would think teams that were operating on more modest budgets would advocate for it. But I think we've been... Stale isn't a word I want to throw around too frequently because it'll quickly become, ironically enough, stale in the podcast environment. But given that we haven't seen much growth on the salary cap front or much growth in the most recent years on the expansion front, it kind of just adds itself to a list of things that potentially should have been changed by now, given that most teams are currently operating commercially, at least, where they are making a profit. So while the salary cap continues, if it's not being used to prevent those monopolies and prevent those establishments, then I'm not entirely sure what is. I don't personally think there is a top 4. I think there's potentially a top 6 at the moment in terms of the way that they are operating their backroom structures and their staffing and their resources and facilities. But again, I'm burying future podcast content that people can look forward to if they subscribe to the channel or SoundCloud. But yeah, it's interesting to see these things play out. And again, it's not until you really map it out over a 10 or now 14-year period before you actually see these patterns kind of emerge and understand how to arrest them. The other interesting one, and we'll talk about him further in depth, is Marco Kurz has various times mentioned, even when he first started, that he probably doesn't see himself managing in Australia forever. And he is in the second year of a 2-year contract this season. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out as well, and what his expectations for the season might be, and what it would take to see him hang around the club if he wants to beyond this season. So do you think that plays directly into one of the greatest frustrations for last season, or is there something in particular that was a frustrating aspect of the way the season went?
I think potentially, and just on Kurz as well, his family is still based in Germany. Yeah, I understand that. I think his kids are now grown up, but he did mention it in an advertiser article during the week that going back to Germany to visit them all the time, it's very difficult for him. So I would not be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't see out, if he sees out this contract and then doesn't renew. Yeah,
he has 2 daughters in university. I think it was an interview with Simon Hill or something to that effect, where he highlighted how, and it's one of those things you forget. I think quite often it's easy for us forgetting how isolated we are geographically and with time zones and things like that. It's tough if you support a European side and are up watching them at 4 a.m. every weekend, but for the people that move here for the good of their careers and try and bring families with them, it is a massive adjustment for a lot of people, not just in terms of everything we have here, because it's obviously a great standard of living, but everything you have to leave behind as well. A very interesting one that I don't think gets enough necessary consideration when we talk about these things. So we will go through now the FFA Cup and pre-season results. Obviously, the FFA Cup, you are in the final. Only played one A-League side in that run in Central Coast Mariners. So say what you will about the Mariners over the last few seasons. They essentially are at times an NPL side. But you'll have to listen to our season preview with Brad for the full breakdown of their squad.
I had in my notes here, I was like, we played 4 NPL quality sides.
Do you want me to go back and do it again? I buried your lead. This is how we were going to get you to be that controversial market household name in Adelaide footballing circles, and I've destroyed the punchline for you. This is their 3rd final appearance in 5 seasons. What do you think it is about the football program there that has them consistently performing well so early in the season?
Definitely under Marco Kurz. He makes a very stringent point that because of the nature of pre-season in this country, because of the quality of NPL sides that we can line up against, and the travel that dictates if you go to travel to other A-League sides in order to play them in pre-season, it can take a lot out of the legs and it takes days out of the training regime. So he puts a 100% focus on this competition. So I think the success that we are experiencing under him, last year to make the final in he'd been there 3 months, 4 months, it was remarkable. To see him do it again, you know that it is 100% his goal to get the players conditioned and at that utmost quality and ready to go for the season coming ahead. He probably sees it as an interesting opportunity to win silverware, play competitive football, and at the same time get his players match ready.
Yeah, it's an interesting trend that keeps appearing as well. When you look at consistency across teams, the better administrations in this league are willing to pay. It's not necessarily a case of riches, but it's how they want to operate their football program. If you're operating on a threadbare budget, sometimes you don't have the ability to offer someone a full 12-month contract. It might be a 9-month deal to cover the season. The big example there is Perth, who consistently only sign players for 9 months at a time. Adelaide, to their credit, over the last couple of seasons have consistently done their business early and been more than happy to pay weekly wages or monthly wages from day one of pre-season for the entire squad. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you see the likes of Sydney FC, Melbourne Victory, Melbourne City, Adelaide perform well in these competitions, because they are performing with essentially what is their core group of 20 players from day one of pre-season all the way through. And whereas a lot of other clubs, that whether it's administrative decisions or footballing ones, or just their inability to secure targets or instability in coaching setups, are consistently signing players a week out from the season or 2 weeks out from the season. So I think FFA Cup performance particularly is definitely tied to how quickly and efficiently you manage your business within the transfer window. But we'll talk about all the transfers, both in, out and extended contracts in a moment. We'll touch on a couple of the other friendly results, because they are a little bit mixed, but albeit they have played quite a few and they were early on in pre-season. They have only beaten lower league opposition. Of A-League sides, they drew 0-0 with City in Adelaide and then lost 2-0 in City, to City in Melbourne at the Melbourne... the City Footballing Academy, and then a 2-2 draw with Perth in Adelaide in the lead up to their most recent FFA Cup semi-final win. What do you make of their early pre-season form, and do you think we'll see from Marco Kurz a slightly different structured or looking Adelaide lineup this year?
I have to add this in there. We did beat Melbourne 2-1 a couple of days ago.
Yep.
Behind closed doors at Cooper Stadium. So that when they had 90 minutes, Honda 90 minutes, Toivonen as well. So
yeah, look, everyone's beaten Melbourne so far this pre-season, I think.
They look undercooked, don't they?
Well, everyone will have to tune into the season preview, where I just spent 90 minutes pretty much restraining myself from going on a rant. But the long story short is they're top heavy, and I think there's a lot of teams that will be looking at them in a different light to perhaps some of the football pundits that we're seeing at the moment doing their season previews around the traps.
Yes, definitely. I think it's only Cozzy that's come out with his chest puffed, saying that Melbourne won't make the six. So it's a big call.
Yeah, I think they have enough about them to still make the six, but I don't think they're at foregone conclusion as champions based on the back of essentially two players that they've signed up front. Anyway, I can't. This isn't the platform. This isn't the forum.
Sorry, no, what's happened.
No, it's fine. I'm one of those momentum talkers. Once I get going, that's pretty much it. But yeah, and let's be completely honest, I'm proved wrong way more often than I'm ever proved right. So time will tell at the end of the season.
Stop making such grand predictions.
Yeah, definitely. Let's go through some of the players out for the most recent season. Tarek Elrich returns to Western Sydney Wanderers. Obviously, when he played, he was excellent and he was part of that championship side, but a pretty torrid time with injuries over the last couple of years. What are your most fond memories of his time at the club?
Huge respect for Tarek Elrich. I think the commitment and the loyalty he showed to Adelaide United and the way that he played football was unbelievable. He will, I hope he does return. I really do hope he has a good season, unblemished with injury. He will come home to a rounding applause for sure. My favourite memory of him has to be that incredible goal that he scored. The opposition is slipping from my mind, but
it was Melbourne City, and you know damn well it was Melbourne City, where he went on that run and smacked it in and broke my heart. But yes, it was an exceptional goal.
Yes, I mean, I didn't know that he had that in him. So to see that, I was at that game as well. It was insane. The stadium erupted. But the thing about Tarek Elrich is you can't really pinpoint one moment where you're like, oh, he's had an incredible game, he's had an incredible performance. He is that guy that for 27 games, when he's injury-free, he will give you like a 9 out of 10 performance every week. And you perhaps overlook how good he is and how solid he is as a footballer because he was consistently delivering that high quality.
Yeah, and it's always those players that seem to get more respect from the professionals. Like he's in a lot of PFA teams of the season. And you notice those people that basically you can perform at an average level and then have great games where you're above and beyond that, but just consistency in terms of his play and his reliability anywhere really across the back four, but particularly in the fullback areas, definitely an underrated component, and probably one of those people that you look back on at the end of his career and think, why wasn't he involved in conversations when we were having such difficulty around the right back spot with the Socceroos,
Yeah.
and given his versatility in cup competitions and stuff like that, it is a shame that injuries have curtailed his last few seasons, but definitely a high quality player when he was at his best.
Oh yeah.
The next one, who I thought was a fantastic player for the team last season, is Johan Absalonsen, the Danish international. He's returned to Denmark. When he was good, he was very, very good. What is your read as a fan on him returning to Denmark, and how did you rate his season last year?
He was phenomenal. When he was on the pitch, he did things that no one else in our side was doing. He was single-handedly picking the side up by the scruff of everyone's necks, essentially, and scoring match-winning goals, providing match-winning passes. Like, Johan Absalonsen was a revelation. It was just such a shame that every 3 weeks, it seemed, he was gone again. And then there was a large patch from November through to February, I think it was, where every week they were like, oh, he's back in the next week, he's back in the next week, and he just never returned. So for me, it's such a shame because he was a quality player. For him to return to Denmark now, it's obviously about recuperating his body, finding his peak performance again, which I have no qualms with. When you bring in international players, there's that risk always associated. Is this going to work out? Are they going to adjust to the drier, harder conditions out in Australia, especially coming from Europe? I imagine it to be incredibly different. So I'm sad to see him leave, but at the same time, I do understand.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I've brought this up now, I think, in 8 consecutive podcasts, so I should probably leave it. But when Michael Jakobsen signed last year, he kept having calf issues, and he actually came out and said, look, I'm struggling because I grew up on Scandinavian pitches where, they were so soft underneath, and that was the environment he was training in, playing in, whatever else. And out here, because we are so much more dry and arid a climate, it's so rock hard underneath the ground that he was just having calf problems, thigh problems, hamstring issues, just because his body wasn't quite used to it. And I think he's a bit more acclimatized now, but I don't think there's a coincidence between, like the Scandinavian players come here and while showing tremendous quality, they struggle to retain fitness throughout the course of the year. So I wonder if that, being that he is 31 or 32, was a big part of Absalonsen wanting to return back to Denmark and hopefully prolong his career by playing in a more not useful but familiar environment perhaps. And then there's also considerations around like family and things like that. You never really know what's going on when someone picks up and comes over here for a season.
Yeah, true.
The other one, and this one was a little bit of a surprise, I've always quite enjoyed him, Ben Garuccio getting his move to Hearts in the Scottish Premiership. And from all things considered, has pretty much kicked on and is playing quite a bit of football in their first team at present. What did you make of his performances for the Reds last year, and how do you think he'll go in the Scottish Premiership?
That's a big move for Ben, and if anyone wants to further their career and use Adelaide United as a platform, as we've seen so many players in the past do, you can't hold really any resentment towards these guys. So to see Ben go overseas and play, like you said, start. I saw that goal he scored in pre-season, the cross-cut shot, which sort of lit up the internet a little bit. That was really quite nice. But to be perfectly honest with you, as a defender, Ben Garuccio didn't suit the system that I think Kurz was trying to implement. I think we were found wanting a little too many times when he was the left fullback. Attacking, going forward, sensational. I think probably his best position is a left midfielder, or you could maybe even play him on the wing. His delivery might not be 100%, but he's going to give you pace, direct mobility, and he does have a really good shot on goal. So it's another. I think the way that we've replaced him by bringing in Galloway and Goodwin, I think we're okay on the left-hand side to see him go. But in that respect, I'm not entirely upset that he's gone.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. So he obviously came through Melbourne Heart and Melbourne City, but he's always been an Adelaide boy. He's close friends with Stephen Moore, who's another Adelaide boy as well. When he played for us, he came through the system as a left winger. And for anyone who's ever managed under John Aloisi, if you are half decent and have any amount of pace about you, he'll turn you into a fullback. I'm talking about the likes of Ian Ramsey. There was a whole bunch of different players that were talented wingers that he just insisted upon playing at fullback, and I think Garuccio was one of them.
He butchered them.
But yeah, like a good player. But yeah, definitely not probably the first names on the team sheet in terms of players that you'd think would be heading over to Scotland to make the most of their opportunity. Now, that's not a criticism of him. Hopefully, he does continue to elevate and continues to develop his career a lot further. But I think the other important thing is that you get quite different performances out of Adelaide boys when they return home to play for United. We never saw anything nearing levels of performance or commitment from him. Albeit that does come with age, experience and first team exposure, but there's certainly something very traditional about Adelaide players wanting to return to that environment and performing well for the club. We'll talk about a couple more of them when we get to the signings, but obviously Stefan Walk I think is the other one that comes into that conversation in terms of the platform that you spoke about and elevating their game a little bit further.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, definitely.
So the next one is Mark Okiang, a forward who showed tremendous potential in glimpses. His return to NPL football. What were your thoughts on him as a player? And did he just run out of time and didn't make enough of the limited opportunities he was presented with?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it right there. There was some exceptional performances, but when you were looking for Ochieng to make an impact, maybe he was perhaps he was a victim of his own versatility. And that he was, in my mind, he was a fullback, but we saw Gobao employ him a lot on the wing. I think Marco Kurz last season used him as a right midfielder, and it must be extremely difficult coming through as a youth player trying to break into the first team when you are seen as a utility, as someone that can plug a gap, because you can never really sustain yourself and put your best foot forward. So for Ochieng, it seems like a lot of potential. Perhaps that was mismanaged and quite unfortunate because, again, I have fond memories of Ochieng banging in an epic winner against Melbourne City.
Yeah, I feel like that's going to be a long-running theme because all I can think about is a winner he scored against us as well when we were chasing a game. An important part of the season, but it was a good strike. Can't take it away from him, and he's back where he belongs playing semi-professional football.
Hey.
No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry, Mark. I know he's a fan of the show. He's always welcome on whenever he wants to come. The next one, Jordan O'Doherty, Western City Wanderers. I don't mind Jordan O'Doherty. I think he's a quality player, and this, of course, throws into chaos the Hyundai E-League, where his brother is the FIFA representative for Adelaide United's esports team. On a serious note, though, what did you make of his contribution, and how do you see his move to Western Sydney working out?
I thought he was great. This was the one that took me by surprise, and perhaps the one I'm most lamenting was the loss of O'Doherty. Mainly because Jamie is so good in the E-League, but also he had this assuredness on the ball, quite a maturity in the centre of midfield for such a young footballer. There was talk of him perhaps seeing himself as a winger, and he really wanted to explore his attacking options in the wide areas, which Adelaide are quite stacked in. So if he didn't want to play as a central midfielder, as sort of that box-to-box, which I think he was employed as quite a lot last season, he maybe wasn't going to fit our system. So for him to go to West Sydney to say I think that's a great move for him. Definitely under a bubble there. He should find some game time and hopefully fulfill his potential, yeah.
I think the interesting one, and I think it speaks volumes for how some of these transfer work, he was involved in all the marketing for the release of the new kits. So his face is still everywhere. It's still on Fox Sports articles. It's still all over the place. So I am curious to see if potentially this was a move that materialised very quickly and rapidly and wasn't necessarily something they wanted, or if it's potentially something that he pushed for if he saw an opportunity to be guaranteed a different role at an A-League level for his own development. Because if you're talking about him wanting to play in wide areas, there is some quality we'll talk about further down the page in that particular area that would potentially going to make it a struggle for him. But yeah, definitely a tidy player, and you'd like to think his career will continue to blossom and he'll develop a little bit further. The next two I'm going to tie together because they've both been released and both were international players. Daniel Adlung, who joined with pretty big fanfare at the start of last season, and Zengis Kavucevic, who came in initially as an injury loan replacement, is that right? And then guaranteed himself a secure contract for the rest of the season. As two international imports, the expectation obviously increases quite a bit on them. What did you make of them both as players, and how do you feel about their releases from the club?
Adlung was a rock. He was wild. I think from the FFA Cup pre-season sort of stint, he came out all guns blazing, scored some incredible solo efforts, was hard at the ball, commanded the middle of the park, and just he looked like a natural partner for Isaias in there. So to see him go up there with Jordan as well, if it wasn't for the replacement in Merko Bolland, I think I'd be a lot more upset than I am. But he was an integral part to us finishing in the top 6 last season. And there are some huge shoes to be filled with his absence to come through. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. Hopefully Bolland can do the job. They're quite different players, but we'll see how Kurz integrates the midfield this season. In terms of Kubusevic, that was a panic buy, I think. We were looking barren up front again, which is a continual issue with Adelaide United. Every season we are plagued by striker injuries or players unable to score more than 10 goals a season. And the most notable thing I think he did was get sent off against Melbourne Victory. So I think that sums up his appearances for Adelaide United.
Yeah, we will talk about the marquees for this season and particularly injury history when we get down to that portion of the page. But it is a recurring theme for Adelaide over the last few seasons. And we'll talk about some of those injuries and where they're coming from as well. There were two... the other one I nearly forgot about. Ersin Gulum, the Turkish international, Australian-born and bred though, returns to, I think it's Hebei Fortune in China, where he was on loan last season. He was an intriguing prospect. When he joined last season, he had the highest FIFA rating of any player in the competition, given his years of experience playing in the Turkish top division and obviously caps for that national side as well. Do you feel he ever performed at that level for you over the last 12 months?
I think there were individual performances, but they were few and far between. Handfuls, 3, 4, 5 games I could pull out and I'd say, oh yeah, Ersin Gulum was definitely worth the investment this season. He had all the potential, like you said. There's no better way to gauge how a player's going to go than by looking at their FIFA rating. And he comes into the side and you think, oh, here we go. We've got a rock, a partner finally for Jordan Elsey or Taylor Regan, whoever wanted to be his partner. It's someone that's going to lead the team, lock it down at the back, and really just be an enigma. Like we're still looking for a partnership that was Mickey Valkanis and Ange Costanzo from the first season. I don't think we've had that since. Maybe when Sasha Ivanovsky was in there. I can't remember now who he partnered. But we thought he was going to be that guy.
So I'll give you one. Consistently, we see issues that teams that struggle at the back because they essentially have, and what we develop really well in Australia, are stopper central defenders that are big, physical, they step to the ball quickly. The diamonds in the rough and the ones that are really tough to bring in are those sort of classier sweeper type players, and you really need that stopper and cover combo in this league given how quickly it moves. I think the best partnership, and the one that you didn't mention, was Jacopo LaRocca as the stopper and Ryan McGowan as the sweeper, kind of mopping up in behind him. And I think that was where... So Ersin Gulum, I thought, had all the tools initially, or like individually, to be a success. But what he didn't have next to him was that covering player to kind of assist him a little bit for his main shortfall, which is probably pace, being a little bit older. He had another stopper next to him in Jordan Elsey or in Taylor Regan, albeit they were on far less wages than him and probably played a lot more given he was suspended and injured quite a bit. But it just felt like he had all the tools individually but didn't necessarily have that player alongside him to provide the other side of that particular foil. And I think that is something, and we'll talk about it a little bit further down, that Adelaide United have struggled to represent. That Valkanis-Costanzo partnership set a standard in terms of a stopper and sweeper. And then the only other times that you've won things are times when you've had that solid central defensive partnership. But it's not just a problem for Adelaide, it's a league-wide one. And it's why I think when we eventually do the episode on our Hall of Fame players, there's quite a few of those classy defenders that are massively underrated in the competition. So we'll go through a couple of signings as well. We'll talk about if we think that partnership is potentially there this season. But one of the players that we've mentioned in that discussion is Jordan Elsey, who has signed a contract extension, one of the longest ones in the league this season, for 3 years. What are your thoughts on his re-signing?
Overjoyed. Completely through with this. I obviously, like we said, it's a heavy bias, so I'm going to overstate this. I think Jordan Elsey could be a Socceroo. I don't think there's anything now other than his previous ACL injuries is standing in his way from establishing himself, especially under Graham Arnold as the Socceroos manager. His extension was wonderful. I think the club needed to repay the faith that he showed within the club, and vice versa as well, because the club stood by Jordan during his injury injury spells a couple of years ago. Offered him that trial at the beginning of last season, got him the year contract, and he was outstanding.
Now, unfortunately, at that point, we did lose our connection with Thomas. You would have heard there was quite an echo during the length of that recording. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get our schedules back together to complete the season preview for Adelaide. But don't despair, Adelaide fans, if you are listening, we will be continuing the season preview and also having Thomas back on to do our FFA Cup preview with Sam, our Sydney FC correspondent. That won't be completed next week. Next week we are doing our W League season preview, and then the following week we'll do our FFA Cup episode where I promise we will return. We will complete talking about some of Adelaide United's pre-season signings and their expectations for the season ahead, and we'll also tie that together with a discussion around their first 2 results of the season. So I do apologise, we were always going to have a technical issue at some point, but I thought it would be better to put up the 48 minutes of great content that we put together rather than nothing at all for Adelaide. But I do appreciate your patience, your understanding, any positive or negative criticism that you may have. Please put it in the comment section below. As always though, I've been Sean, and I will see you guys again in the mixer.